Welcome to Film and Page. I'm Dominic. This is a video I've been wanting to do for a while, but never found the time. It's ranking the 6 original Star Trek films. I know this is something that has been done to death on YouTube, but now it's my turn. When it comes to the big science fiction franchises, Star Trek is my favorite one. Also, I'm always up for watching a Star Trek movie, even the lesser liked ones. If a friend comes over to my house and wants to watch a Star Trek film, I'm down for whichever one they pick, whether it's the motion picture, First Contact, or Star Trek 09. Something I can't say for the Star Wars films. When I was growing up, the 6 original Star Trek films were some of my favorite movies. I watched them over and over again. That's why I decided to keep this video just to the first 6 films. With that said, let's get into the video. At the bottom of the list is Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, released June 9th, 1989. Taking place at what seems to be shortly after the events of Star Trek IV, the Enterprise crew is on shore leave on Earth after a shakedown cruise of the Enterprise A, when orders come in from Starfleet that human, Romulan, and Klingon ambassadors have been taken hostage by a renegade Vulcan named Sybok on the planet of intergalactic peace. The Federation is sent to investigate, but it turns out to be a trap, and the hostages are actually followers of Sybok, who seems to have some strange persuasive mind control powers, and is also Spock's half-brother. They take control of the Enterprise for Sybok to use on a quest to find God himself. I don't think there is much of a debate to say that The Final Frontier is the weakest link in this chain of 6 films. I remember when I saw this film, and I clearly remember being underwhelmed by the movie, even to the point where I felt for the first time with a Star Trek movie, disappointment. It has the weakest written story of the 6, and it also has the worst special effects. William Shatner, who directed the film, was trying to comment on the big televangelists who were hugely popular back in the 80s, and how many of them succumbed to scandal, with Sybok leading his own cult of followers to the center of the galaxy to find God. Not a bad premise for a story, but I don't think it was quite pulled off. The whole storyline comes off as pretty cheesy. Then there is Sybok himself, who was revealed to be Spock's half-brother, a retcon from what was established, as it was never mentioned before or ever again that Spock had a half-brother, which really adds nothing to the story. He could have been just a rogue Vulcan who had known Spock in his youth, although the character has popped back up on Strange New Worlds. With its flaws, though, I do get in the mood for this film from time to time. It does have some good stuff in there that make it a fun watch. I love the camping scenes, also scenes between Kirk, Spock, Bones, and Sybok, when Sybok reveals each of their pains, and Kirk gives the speech about how we need our pain, for it makes us who we are. Another thing is that although I've always been a Star Trek fan, my interest in it would dip at times, and the release of Star Trek V didn't really reignite it. Also, the movie was overshadowed by Batman, which was set to be released shortly after, and I had full-blown Bat fever at this point, as I had gotten into the character 2 years earlier. Finally, I will say this. I would dislike this film a lot more if it was the last film in the series, but thankfully it's not. Next we have Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, also known as The One with the Whales, released November 26, 1986. Picking up after the events of Search for Spock, Kirk and crew find themselves still on Vulcan, with their commandeered Klingon bird of prey. Spock, having been recently resurrected, is not back to his old self yet. They leave for Earth, where they must face a court-martial, when a mysterious probe comes to Earth, and whose signal is so powerful it is destroying the planet. Kirk and the others then realize the probe is trying to communicate with humpback whales, which are now extinct, so they must risk time travel to retrieve a pair from the past. This was the second Star Trek movie I saw in the theater, and I know that this is one of the more popular ones of the original 6 films, and I do like the movie. I just like the other ones ahead of it a bit more. Also, when I think of memorable movie-going experiences, this one was a memorable one. But there is another one on this list that is just a bit more memorable, and we'll get to that one later on. Out of the original 6, I must say that this film has the most heart. It is a lighthearted comedy almost, but not to the point where it undercuts the film or feels cringe. After watching the first 3 films, which are pretty serious, Part 5 is a nice departure from the heavier films, and the chemistry of the cast is at its best in this film. Also, it is one that appeals to most non-Star Trek fans. This one is my girlfriend's favorite out of the original 6. As for the story itself, I always thought the premise of why they had to go back in time cool, with a mysterious alien probe that had visited Earth in the distant past and made contact with whales, now returning to follow up and see why they lost contact. I love that the probe was a complete mystery. We don't know how it really functioned, or who made it. I also really like the design of the probe. It's just a black cylinder with that glowing ball dropping out of one end of it. The one thing about this film that I never really cared for, and it stood out to me even as a kid, is the musical score for the film. I like the main theme, but I didn't care for the rest of it. It has grown on me over the years, but I still think it has one of the weakest scores out of the 6 films. Lastly, there is one thing in particular that stands out in my memory when I first saw this movie. One of the trailers before the start of the film was for Star Trek The Next Generation, which I had no idea was a thing or was going to be a thing. That trailer was the first I had ever seen or heard of anything about a new Star Trek show, so it was a very memorable surprise. In the number 4 spot is Star Trek The Motion Picture, released December 7th, 1979. A massive cloud of energy is on a direct course with Earth, and it has incredibly destructive powers, as it destroys anything that gets in its way. Meanwhile, the USS Enterprise, under the command of Captain William Decker, is undergoing a major refit. However, it is the only ship close enough to intercept the energy cloud before it reaches Earth. Kirk, now an admiral, uses the crisis as a way to once again take command of the Enterprise and reunite his original crew. They must go with a ship that is barely ready and face a vastly superior alien force. Now I know that this is one of the least popular of the original Trek films. Even the actors involved didn't really like it. But when I was a kid, I loved it, as did my older brother and best friend. I never knew this was as disliked as it was until I got on the internet back in 2001. I guess the 3 of us were just living in the small bubble with this movie. I do get why other fans don't like the film, as many find it to be slow-moving and boring, which is how it got its name, the slow motion picture, with the cast not really having the same chemistry as they did in the original series. I, on the other hand, don't mind the slower pace of the story, and I've always found the story to be interesting, even though it did recycle ideas from the TOS episode The Changeling from Season 2. The opening of this film with the Klingon battlecruisers attacking V'ger is one of my favorite openings of a science fiction movie. I think it's right up there with the Star Destroyer flyover at the beginning of Star Wars. The Klingon ships are shot in a way that makes them look massive, and we get to see the updated Klingons for the first time. We also get to hear the Klingon theme for the first time, a theme that would be used for the Klingons in Trek for decades after. Not only that, I love the long drawn-out scene of Scotty showing off the newly refitted Enterprise to Kirk before docking the shuttle. I've heard people complain that the scene is too long, but I enjoy getting to see all of the newly refitted Enterprise with the awesome Jerry Goldsmith score. I also love the ending, where Decker merges with V'ger, becoming a new being and ascending beyond our universe. That whole sequence in combination with Jerry Goldsmith's score is just epic. Speaking of the score, without a doubt, this film has the best score of them all. Also for me, it stands apart from the other 5 movies as it has a very 70s flavor to it, with the pastel colors and orange furniture in the ship, something that was common with a lot of 70s science fiction. The 5 films that came after are firmly 80s films. What I find interesting is that this film, as the story goes, was a response to Star Wars, as Paramount wanted to cash in on the science fiction boom that film created. but instead of emulating Star Wars, they went in a 2001 Space Odyssey direction. I actually saw the motion picture quite a bit later. I saw it for the first time at some point between the release of Star Trek IV and Star Trek V. It was never shown on TV, and it wasn't widely available to rent anywhere, until it finally popped up at one of the local video stores, and I was able to get it. So for a while there was this missing link between the original series and the films, and I didn't quite know how the two continuities were connected until I finally saw the motion picture. Now we are going into the top 3 with Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, released December 6, 1991. This story picks up several years after the events of Star Trek V, when the Klingon moon Praxis explodes due to overmining, and the accident causes severe damage to the atmosphere of the Klingon homeworld, which puts the Klingons in a situation where they need help from the Federation, and the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon reaches out for an end to hostilities between the two governments. The USS Enterprise, under the command of James T. Kirk, is chosen to meet with the Klingons at the edge of the neutral zone and escort them through Federation space to Earth for peace talks. When seemingly the Enterprise fires 2 torpedoes at the Klingon ship, crippling their artificial gravity field, then 2 Federation officers wearing gravity boots and helmets to conceal their identity beam over and assassinate Chancellor Gorkon. Kirk and Bones beam over to the Klingon ship to try to save the Chancellor's life, but he dies anyway. Kirk and McCoy are then arrested and taken by the Klingons. It is up to Spock and the crew of the Enterprise to piece together how they were framed in the attack, along with saving Kirk and Bones. What they find is a conspiracy to stop the peace between the Federation and the Klingons. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I always was a fan of Star Trek, but my interest in the series would have highs and lows. Well, Star Trek VI came out at a low point, so I didn't get to see this one in the theaters, which I regret not going to see it to this day. I wouldn't see it until it came out on video rental. Next to the motion picture, Undiscovered Country has my second favorite opening to a Trek film, with the exploding moon of Praxis. Then we get to see the Excelsior again, under the command of Captain Sulu, which then encounters the energy wave from the exploded Praxis moon. It's a fantastic sequence. What I also love about this film is in Star Trek IV, they have no Enterprise, and Spock is not his usual self. Then in Star Trek V, the Enterprise isn't working right, and also Spock is still not quite his old self. In this film, however, they are all back to top form for their final outing. Along with that, Christopher Plummer as General Chang made for a great antagonist. Speaking of Klingons, it made perfect sense to have them as the antagonists of the final Trek film to feature the original crew, with the Federation and Klingon Empire finally making peace, since they were the main villains of the original series and half of the original films. Also, the events of this film ties it all back to previous Star Trek lore, right back to the first appearance of the Klingons in the TOS episode Errand of Mercy, and how the Organians predicted that the Federation and Klingon Empire will be at peace in the future. Also, back to Star Trek TNG, where we see a Klingon serving on board the Enterprise D, with the hostility between the Federation and the Klingons no longer a thing. When it comes to wrapping up a series, whether it is films or a TV show, it seems a lot of the times it is underwhelming, disappointing, and in some cases flat out insulting. But Star Trek VI pulls it off perfectly. It is one of my all-time favorite endings to a series. In the number 2 spot is Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, released June 1st, 1984. Picking up immediately after the events of Star Trek II, the Enterprise limps its way home, having left Spock's body behind on the newly formed Genesis planet. However, someone on board has forced their way into Spock's quarters. It turns out to be Dr. McCoy, who, for an instant, seems to be speaking in Spock's voice. Kirk then learns, after a visit from Sarek, Spock's father, that Dr. McCoy is carrying Spock's Katra. and that both Spock's body and Katra must be returned to Vulcan, so they can be laid to rest. Kirk then defies a direct order from Starfleet Command not to return to the Genesis planet, stealing the Enterprise and sabotaging the Excelsior. Kirk and crew are off to find Spock. Star Trek: The Search for Spock will always have a special place for me, because it was the first Star Trek film I saw theatrically, and it was a very memorable one. Since this movie came out, there has been so much Star Trek since then, so this movie might seem slow or not that special by today's standards. But when I was a kid, before this, all I had seen was the reruns of the original series and The Wrath of Khan on a 12-inch TV, and not always in color. So when that Klingon bird of prey decloaked for the first time on that huge screen, it was really something awesome, along with seeing space dock for the first time and the USS Excelsior. No one had seen stuff like that before. It was all for the first time in this film. The Klingon bird of prey and the Excelsior would go on to be very popular ship designs right to this day. Also, Christopher Lloyd as Commander Krug always chews up every scene he's in, a worthy follow-up villain to Khan. Also, since I didn't see Star Trek the Motion Picture until a few years after, this film was my first time seeing the updated Klingons. Finally, I'll end with this. James Horner's score for this film is probably one of my second favorites of the series. The number one spot, we have Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, released June 4th, 1982, taking place at some undetermined point in time after the events of Star Trek the Motion Picture. We find the USS Enterprise under the command of Captain Spock, and is now being used as a training vessel. Meanwhile, the USS Reliant is looking for a suitable planet to test the Genesis device, which can terraform a lifeless dead planet into a sustaining one in minutes. They are investigating Ceti Alpha 6 as a candidate when they detect a life form on the planet. Captain Terrell and his first officer, Pavel Chekhov, beam down to investigate and come across an old set of cargo containers. They go inside to investigate when Chekhov sees a belt buckle with the name Botany Bay on it. He realizes this is the home of Khan. He tells his captain they have to get out of there right away. But it is too late. They are seized by Khan and his men. Using parasites native to the planet, he takes control of Captain Terrell and Chekhov, then uses them to take control of the USS Reliant. Khan then begins to plot his ultimate revenge on Kirk. The Wrath of Khan would be, by today's standards, considered a soft reboot. The motion picture, despite making a lot of money at the box office, cost a lot of money to make, and had mixed reviews from a lot of fans along with critics at the time. So the sequel had to fix the problems of the first film, which it did. The chemistry between the original cast was back like it was in the original series. Also, it was made on a much smaller budget. It had more action, so it wasn't boring like the first film, and they ditched the pastel uniforms for red ones. This would cement the look of the series going forward. Now at this point, this is such an obvious choice. This is so many Star Trek fans' favorite Trek film, and is considered to be the best film in the entire 13-film series by many to this day. So what can I say? I love this movie. And it was the first Star Trek movie I ever saw. When I was a kid, I even had this tradition where I would rent The Wrath of Khan every Easter break from school. I loved that it was a sequel to an episode of the original series, and Khan is one of my favorite villains in Star Trek. The battle between the Reliant and the Enterprise is my all-time favorite ship-to-ship battle. Also, the James Horner score is a grand slam. I wish I had seen all the Star Trek films in the theater when I was a kid, especially this one, but I had to settle for catching it whenever it was on TV. I did eventually get to see it up on the big screen as an adult. And that is my ranking of the 6 original Star Trek films. A pretty solid series of movies. And that old notion that only the even films are good, I think is pure bullshit. And that's everything I have to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I'll see you at the next one. I'd like to say thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all in helping this channel grow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded.